Everyone, and welcome to our second Free New York webinar. We deeply appreciate you joining us today, and will be an opportunity to hear from campaign leaders, organizers, and advocates to get an in-depth look at how we transform New York's unjust bail laws. This is the second of a three-part series. On Monday, we talked about the Free New York campaign as a whole. Tonight, we'll focus specifically on bail reform. On Friday, we'll dig deep into overhauling discovery law. For each webinar, we will be asking, what does real reform look like? How do we ensure that new legislation truly decarcerates jails and protects the rights and liberties of New Yorkers across the state? As a campaign led by people who have been directly impacted by systems of mass incarceration, how do we ensure that elected officials are held accountable for transforming these systems and repairing harm? I want to thank all of the organizations who are co-sponsoring this series, including Just Leadership USA, Latino Justice, Citizen Action of New York, the New York Civil Liberties Union, New York Communities for Change, Vocal New York, Brooklyn Community Bail Fund, Legal Aid Society of New York, Brooklyn Defender Services, Lost Defenders, Color of Change, and Working Families Organization. Well, hi everyone, my name is Marvin Mitchell, and I'm a leader in the Free New York campaign. As a member of Just Leadership USA is dedicated to, Just Leadership USA is dedicated to cutting the U.S. correctional population in half by 2030. We believe that empowering people most affected by incarceration to drive policy reform. In October 2017, in partnership with organizations across the state, we launched the Free New York campaign. Well, before we begin, I want to share our agenda and a few logistics. Today, we will hear from a powerful panel of organizers and advocates. I will moderate this conversation and then invite you all to respond during the Q&A. Finally, I'll talk through how we got here, how we push this powerful fight forward, and how everyone can step into action. You can submit your questions in the chat box at any time, and we will draw from them when we reach the Q&A. We'll also be recording so that you'll be able to share the event with others. Finally, we'll be conducting polls throughout so that we can engage with you as much as possible. You'll see a box appear on your screen, and you'll have a minute to respond to the question. Our first question to you is, have you or a loved one been impacted by the bail system? Well, I want to thank you in advance for all of your responses. As we continue talking, please feel free to comment and share stories on the chat box. This work is led by people who have been directly impacted, and we know the commitment and the struggle for those of us who are. We also appreciate those who have not been and are committed to this fight for justice. Speaking our truth is a key to our power. Before we dive into the panel, I want to talk a little bit about why we do this work. New York has a jails crisis. On any given day, 25,000 plus New Yorkers are held in county jails across the state. Nearly 70% are legally innocent. They've not been convicted, but remain caged because of our broken bail, speedy trial, and discovery laws. This violates the fundamental protection of our justice system, that you are innocent until proven guilty. It also has devastating intergenerational impacts on people and their families. This is not justice. New Yorkers must not languish behind bars while their constitutional rights to due process and fair trial are consistently violated. As the Free New York campaign, we are fighting for a complete overhaul of New York's pretrial system with the clarity that real reform decarcerates jails, ends money bails, protects the constitutional due process rights of all people, ends profiteering in the pretrial system, and protects against the jailing of legally innocent people. Those are the values and outcomes of any true reform. In this panel, we will focus specifically on the crisis of bail and how we overhaul this unjust system. Ladies and gentlemen, our first speaker is Scott Levy. He's the special counsel to the criminal defense practice at the Bronx Defenders. In 2011, Scott developed and managed the Bronx Defenders Marijuana Arrest Project and now directs the Bronx Defenders Fundamental Fairness Project. Followed by him, our next speaker is Priscilla Esche, a leader of the Free New York campaign in Westchester County. She's an entrepreneur, a magazine co-owner, and somebody who has walked through the system herself. Our final speaker today is Danielle Ponder, a public defender, community activist, and R&B soul artist from Rochester, New York. With our first question will be directed to Priscilla. Hi, Priscilla.
Hi, how are you? How's everyone doing?
Good, good. Great to hear you. Well, I'll pose the first question to you, Priscilla. And because of our money bail system, there are thousands of New Yorkers locked up in pretrial and county jails around the state.
Yes.
You know firsthand about this crisis and
do.
the impact for people and their families. Yes. Will you share how you came to be locked up pretrial and the consequences for you and your family?
Absolutely. I was locked up for a very long time pre-trial, and it was because of money bail. And it was, there was a lack of, there was a failure in New York's discovery laws. I was arrested for standing up to an abusive partner, and even though I had made previous complaints, you know, it still fell back on me. My bail was $25,000, and you do need 10% of that. At the time, my family just wasn't in a position to do something like that. So I had a portion of the money, and it was locked up in the items that I surrendered, but I couldn't access it, and it wasn't enough. So I just sat in jail, and I was basically guilty until I was proven innocent. And it had a tremendous impact on my life and my family's life. My youngest was taken from, he didn't know who I was when I came home. You know, I had to put him to my chest so he can hear my heartbeat and get reacclimated to me being his mom again, you know. And I didn't get visits with my kids for 2 whole years. You know, I really had to fight the system, and that's the way the Westchester County system is. You know, my child had to actually learn how to reconnect with his mom, and that's difficult. It's difficult.
Yeah, sure.
You know, there were days when I wrote my children a letter, and you know, that was the last letter that I was going to write them. I feel like I had failed as a parent, and you do have suicidal thoughts. You go through a culmination of emotions because you just don't know where to begin. And it's anger, you know, mad at yourself, mad at the system. And I had come from a lineage of strong women, and if I hadn't come from that, I would have never made it. I would have never made it. So that's my story of dealing with the bail system and the lack of discovery, etc.
Oh, well, thank you, Priscilla, for sharing that with us. But I just want to clarify one thing that you mentioned. You said that you would have to have 10% of that to get yourself out of bail, but and that's only if you use the services of a bail bondsman or bail bond service.
That's
without using that, you would be responsible for providing the entire amount in full to pay to the courts. And we all know that the bail bond system is completely just as flawed as our other bail systems, and with these predatory loans and these disreputable bail bondsmen. So I think we should just clarify that so that our listeners know. Okay, and so Priscilla, in the end, you ended up taking a plea deal. I think it's sometimes hard for people to understand why some people who maintain their innocence would take a plea deal. Will you tell us what that looks like?
I mean,
why you took
choice. I had to take a plea deal because I wanted to come home and start my life again, whatever that looked like. You know, I had been locked up for so long, you know, and it was just so much pressure. And
Mm-hmm.
wanted my kids back. I wanted to get back to my kids, and I felt helpless, and I felt like I had no other choice.
Mm-hmm.
Medical issues, extreme stress, and you know, if you cry about it in court, they call you emotionally unstable, which was the term that they used about me. So if I hadn't cried for my children, what then would they call me? You know, it's just you're fighting the entire
Mm-hmm.
world to get your life back, to get back to you. And the sad thing about it is I was proven innocent,
Mm-hmm.
but I was still treated as if I was
Right.
guilty. You know,
As
so
a as a
I had to take a plea deal.
as a significant portion of people who are incarcerated or detained are proven innocent after or vindicated of these charges.
Yeah.
Priscilla, I understand and I feel for you. I know personally that the trauma is real, and it's something that is takes a while to, or maybe never to get over. It's just something you need to deal with. So I applaud you.
Yeah, it
Uh,
remained.
right. I wanted to direct my next question to Scott. Hi, Scott. How are you? Scott Levy.
Doing well,
How
thank
are
you.
Good, good.
Doing great, thanks.
As an experienced public defender, will you tell us how New York's bail system works and why we desperately need reform?
Sure. So when we're talking about bail, what has generally happened is a person has been arrested on the street, in their home, somewhere out in the world, taken to a police precinct, and then brought to court for their arraignment. And at that arraignment, a bail application is made by the district attorney. And a bail application is the district attorney asking the judge to set an amount of money that must be paid in order for that person to be released pending their trial. What we know is that bail is supposed to be a mechanism of release, right? It is supposed to be something that a person posts in order to assure that they can be at liberty during the pendency of their case and guarantee that they come back to court for each and every court date. But what we know is that across the state and in New York City, people are held in jail during the pendency of their case, unable to pay for the price of their freedom. Judges are supposed to take into consideration a person's ability to pay the bail. However, we know that that's just not what's happening in the courts across this state. Judges are routinely setting bail at an amount that people cannot make, and people are sitting in for the duration of their case. And when this happens, when somebody is sitting in jail simply because they can't afford the price of their freedom, it really calls into question the presumption of innocence, right? Our system is predicated on a belief that everyone is innocent until proven guilty. But because of our broken bail system, we are punishing people before they are ever convicted of anything. And it really turns the entire system on its head. So the need for bail reform, I think, it has been made crystal clear by just the sheer number of New Yorkers and people that are in jail, you know, day in and day out, and just the glaring and obvious need to rethink the way that we do pretrial justice to make sure that it's not what's in your wallet that determines whether or not you are free during your case.
Mm-hmm. So the need is to be clear that an arrest does not equal guilt. Are we right there?
Absolutely, absolutely. An arrest and the filing of a case is really an allegation, right? It's an accusation, but it is not a conviction. And our system guarantees that people are entitled to a trial and due process before they can actually be found guilty and punished for what they were accused of.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Are there any statistics pertaining to the ethnicity or economic status of defendants who come before arraignment?
I mean, you know, from the beginning of time, but certainly for every statistic that's ever been, all the data that's ever been collected, the overwhelming majority of people, and the disproportionate number of people who are coming before our courts and who are being held in on bail that they can't make, are low income and low income people of color. The effects of this broken bail system have always fallen disproportionately on communities of color. And that is true, you know, in New York City, across New York State, and all across the country. Wherever you look, you find disparate impact on communities of color and on low income communities.
Oh, Well, thank you for clarifying that, Scott. I appreciate it. My next question is going to be directed toward Danielle. Hi, Danielle.
Hi, hello.
Okay, how's it going? As a former public defender in Rochester, will you tell us about the impact you saw the bail system on people's lives?
Absolutely. I first just want to say that I am so moved by Priscilla's story. I feel like she just gave just a personal narrative that just really sums up why this is such an issue. And her story is a story that I've seen often. I mean, you know, if you just think about, you know, if you were taken away from where you currently are right now, listening to this webinar, if you were picked up by the police and you were taken away, let's not even say 2 years, let's just say 3 months. If you think about what would be disrupted in your life, whether that's your rent, so your housing, certain bills that you have to pay, what happens to your children, what happens to, you know, your pets, whatever it might be, just think about your life being disrupted. And it's not like the majority of these people are getting, you know, you have to be to court on Friday at 2. Most of the time, the majority of these cases, people are being picked up from their homes without much notice, right? So what I have seen, I've seen clients who have mental health issues who have waited 2 months to get a mental health appointment, and they lose that appointment because they're incarcerated. Or perhaps they're going through the process with DSS to get housing or to get certain support, and they've worked so hard to get an appointment or to follow through with the program, and that program is completely disrupted. I had a client who was the sole provider for 3 children and his girlfriend who was disabled, and he lost his job because he was held in custody. And as the law sees it, these people have done nothing. As the law sees this, these are innocent people, right, who have not been convicted of committing any crimes whatsoever, but they are punished. And then just lastly, I would say when it comes to pleas, unfortunately, people are more likely to take a plea when they're in custody. I know a judge that if you're out of custody, he'll never put you back in. But when you're in, you're probably not getting out, right? The offer is going to be, oh, well, he's already in, so maybe 30 more days or, 6 more months. And for most people, they don't want to sit in custody fighting a case because they'll end up staying in custody longer. But when it comes to plea bargains, people are more likely to take a plea when they're in custody than being, out and being able to fight their case.
Thanks, Danielle. Well, it seems that it's typical from what you say that a person that's detained tends to stay detained, and a person that's at liberty tends to stay at liberty. Is that correct? Can you hear me?
Yes. I think that when people are in custody, the offers from the district attorney or getting the judge to agree to an offer typically involves jail time.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. We're going back to Scott again. Scott?
Yes.
Yes, Scott. What needs to be driving values of a true bail reform? And what do we need to ensure any bail legislation includes?
Sure. So I think it's really important for us to begin from a place and acknowledging really the destruction and the harm that years of mass incarceration have produced in New York and across the country, right? And I think our drive for bail reform has to be guided by a desire to decarcerate. That is, to get to reverse the trend of mass incarceration. And so I think when we think about bail reform, the first question we always need to ask ourselves is, are more people going to be released from jail because of this reform? Because we know that, again, we are incarcerating just staggering numbers of people across this country, and the disproportionate number of them are Black and brown people. and that the fundamental harm and injustice that is embedded in our criminal justice system is this disparity. And so any bail reform really has to tackle that head on. In New York, we've had a really wonderful debate over the course of this legislative session about what bail reform in New York should look like. And I'll use the bill that came out of the Senate Democrats as an example that was introduced by Senator Gianaris. The bill itself does a number of really important things. First, it completely eliminates the use of money bail in the pretrial justice system. So under that bill, no longer would a person's freedom be determined by how much money they have. And I think the one thing to understand is how the use of money bail has been a mechanism for mass incarceration, since time immemorial. And so the reduction of our reliance on the money bail system is absolutely essential to ensuring meaningful bail reform. With our overwhelming goal always being decarceration and getting more people out of jail. The other thing we need to we need to reduce the influence of money bail on the system. And then we need to make sure that whenever pretrial detention is at issue, whenever someone is at risk of being detained pretrial, that we put as many protections in place as we can to ensure that we don't use pretrial incarceration as the default, right? That we are not just locking people up because it's the easy thing to do. And so the Gianaris bill, I think, does this quite well. It really strictly limits the categories of people who are even eligible for pretrial detention or preventive detention, which is incarceration without even the opportunity to post bail, right? It is just incarceration for the pendency of the case. That we limit the categories of people who are at risk of pretrial detention as much as we possibly can. And that whenever we are considering pretrial detention, we make sure that there is a robust procedure in place to ensure that there's individualized justice. And what that looks like is, hearings where people can present evidence and talk about all of the different options that are available to keep this person out of jail while they're fighting their case, so that they can fight their case and be on even footing with everyone else. And so reducing incarceration, reducing the influence of money bail, ensuring due process, and making sure that when we are dealing with hard cases, we take those seriously. So we know that a lot of people who are charged with violent crimes, that are technically violent crimes, end up in jail. But we also know from all of the data and statistics that those people do not need to be in jail. The vast majority of them, no one really needs to be in jail, but the vast majority of people that we incarcerate pretrial on violent felonies are not people who are going to be reoffending. They are going to come back to court. And so we need to make sure that even with the hard cases, right, even when people are charged with offenses that are deemed violent, that we're giving those people as much due process as they deserve. So that we are using pretrial detention only as a last resort. And what I often tell people is when you're thinking about bail reform, right, we should be reducing the ability of judges to put people in jail. And we should be making release easy, and we should be making detention hard, right? Anytime you put somebody in jail, it should be a difficult decision. And I think we need to acknowledge that and embrace that.
Well, thank you. I agree 100% with that. Make it a hard decision to incarcerate someone rather than to release them. One other question I have for you right now, Scott. There have been a lot of proposals made for bail reform, and we need to be really clear that some of them are powerful, transformative bills, and that some of them have really critical and dangerous flaws. What do we need to be wary of? What do we need to ensure is not in any bail legislation?
Well, I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is what we're really trying to do with our bail system, and that is to make sure that people come back to court so they can have their day in court and that they can actually have the due process that the Constitution guarantees them. And what that means is not falling victim or succumbing to pressures to treat different types of cases differently. So the types of cases that get headlines, there's often a pressure for politicians to sort of create carve-outs for these types of special types of cases. We've already talked about crimes that are deemed violent, right? There are a number of crimes in the New York penal law that are violent crimes that actually involve no act of violence whatsoever. The Khalif Browder story is the perfect example. Right. That was a case where he was alleged to have taken a backpack. There was no violence alleged, but because it was technically under our penal law a burglary, it was classified as a violent offense. We need to make sure that just because something is deemed violent, that we don't then write those people off, right? We don't carve them out of justice. We need to be consistent, and we need to say that for everyone, the presumption of innocence matters, regardless of what you're charged with. So we need to be really careful about carving anybody out of what we all agree should be the robust system of pretrial justice that we all deserve. We also, I think, in New York, one thing that I always think is important to highlight for people is to be wary of bail reforms that have been rolled out in other states. There's a lot that can be said about this topic, but in a lot of other states, the trend in bail reform movements across the country is to implement what are called risk assessment instruments. And again, these are really complicated instruments, but what it really does is it takes massive amounts of data and then reduces people to a number score, right? That they are either low risk, medium risk, or high risk according to some algorithm that is created using all of this data. And that a person's liberty and freedom pre-trial is in large part determined by how they score on this algorithmic instrument. I think that these types of sort of algorithms are really dangerous for everyone, but particularly in New York, and that we have the opportunity in New York to create a new type of system that is a leader and the most progressive version of bail reform in the country that does not rely on these risk assessment instruments. And just to make clear, what these risk assessment instruments do is predict whether a person will be dangerous in the future. And I think the hubris involved in trying to predict whether someone will be dangerous in the future is a really dangerous thing for us to protect against. So I think we need, the advocacy community in New York has done a really wonderful job at making it clear that we will not accept the introduction of risk assessment tools and dangerousness assessments in our bail system. And I just think we need to hold that line because it's absolutely crucial that we do so. And of course, we need to eliminate the influence of money in our system. We need to reduce it as much as possible. And we need to just eliminate the bail bond industry completely. The bail bond industry is exploitative, it's predatory, it really serves no legitimate purpose in our system, and all it does is drain much needed resources from communities that are already hard pressed for those resources. So I think we need to do our best to eliminate the bail bond industry, and I'll leave it there.
Okay, well, thank you, Scott. I agree with you wholeheartedly on the bail bond industry. And as an interesting sidebar, there are only two countries in the world that allow that bail for profit, which is the Philippines and the United States. There's something fundamentally wrong with that picture. Okay, so let's move on. I'm going to go to Priscilla. I have another question for you, Priscilla. Are you there?
Sure, absolutely. I'm here.
Okay. One issue that has come up in the assembly is that some legislators want to maintain money bail for domestic violence misdemeanor charges. What do you think about that?
I know people's hearts are in the right place, but this is not a solution. Two things that everybody has to remember. Police often arrest survivors. And this is particularly true if the survivors are women of color, Black women, low income, or LGBTQ. And if money bail is set, low income survivors can be incarcerated pre-trial for months and even years. And here are statistics for you. In New York City study, 66% of survivors who were arrested alongside or instead of their abusive partners were African American or Latina, and 43% were living below the poverty line. In a survey of domestic violence survivors, 1 in 4 women, 1 in 4, reported they had been arrested or threatened with arrest during a partner's abuse incident or while reporting an IPV to the police, which is what happened in my case. The second thing I want people to remember is that money bail targets working class people. Wealthy people with easy access to resources don't sit in jail pre-trial. They just don't.
That's right.
And this means that they can be arrested for the same charge and out the next day. Gone. Money bail does not create safety. And it's a deeply unjust in terms of the outcome. And I am living proof of that. So there has to be a lot of changes made.
Thank you, Priscilla.
Absolutely.
I think that this is a great time for us to open up this call for other questions our listeners may have. Listeners, please remember, you can type your question in on your control panel or Zoom or on the comment thread on the Facebook Live. Okay. Let me see if we have any questions coming through yet. Okay, it looks like we're trying to pull up some questions from our listeners. Okay.
Hi, Marvin. There are questions in the Q&A webinar 2 Google documents. Do you see them?
I don't see them.
Great. I will ask the first one. Hi, everybody.
Okay.
This is Katie Schaefer from Just Leadership USA, who is working the technological back end. Thank you all for sitting through any technological difficulties we have. So the first question we have from Saroj Saeed is, do we have any statistics on the numbers of people in jail whose charges are eventually dismissed? And Scott, I thought maybe this would be a question for you.
Sure. You know, the sad answer is not really. There have been small studies done, you know, in different locations. One of the things that has emerged, I think, during this bail reform debate in New York is how little we often know about our criminal justice system. You know, just how hard it is to get good statistics about these cases. What I can say is that in a lot of cases, and particularly in misdemeanor cases, but certainly in felony cases as well, in a lot of misdemeanor cases, in New York City at least, the vast majority end in dismissals, or you know, what's called an adjournment in contemplation of dismissal, which ultimately results in a dismissal, or non-criminal violations. And certainly the vast majority result in non-incarceratory sentences. So that is, people are not being sentenced to jail. So, and you know, it is also absolutely true that when a person is incarcerated due to bail on their case, they are far more likely to get an incarceratory sentence. As Danielle said, there have been a number of studies that show that if a person is incarcerated, they are far more likely to get a jail sentence. And we certainly see that. So what we do know is that lots of cases do end up in dismissal, but a lot of cases that would be dismissed end up in pleas when bail is set and when the person is detained pre-trial. And so what is absolutely clear from every study I've ever seen, all the statistics I've ever seen, is that bail and pretrial detention really sort of distort our justice system, right? It creates incentives for people to plead guilty. It makes it far more likely that you will not get a trial, that you will end up doing time, and that your case, whether it is a good case or a bad case, will end up in some sort of conviction because people have a ton of pressure just to plead guilty to get cases over with, and so they can return to their lives.
Okay, well, thanks. There's a second part to that question, which we will address to Danielle. Danielle, how does bail work in Rochester, and is there any difference from how it works in New York City? Is the system better or worse?
I don't know if you can hear me, but I lost connection. Can you hear me though?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Okay. In regards to whether it's worse, I guess I could say, just based on what Scott just said in regards to most misdemeanors ending in violations, that's definitely not true for Monroe County. I would say, especially if you're in custody, most of our misdemeanors are ending in misdemeanor convictions with jail time, unless you don't have any criminal record whatsoever. But if you have a previous record, you're most likely going to get an offer to a misdemeanor. And if you're in custody, it's definitely going to require a jail sentence from the district attorney. The other thing that I will say happens in Monroe County, I don't know if this happens in New York City, but it's almost a given. If you have a felony charge, you will not receive any, the judge will set bail on you. You will not be released on your own recognizance. So even a felony charge such as driving on a suspended license, the judge is going to set bail. So there's almost like this blanket policy in Monroe County that if it's a felony, whether you have a history or not, you're most likely going to get cash bail set on you. So I'm not sure if that's true in New York City, but that's just something that happens in Monroe County.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Danielle. Do we have another question?
Marvin, we just got pulled up the DCJS data to answer Saroj's question about the percentages of dismissals. So could we pass it back to Scott to talk that through?
Great, Scott. Would you please address that again?
Absolutely, and it turns out that I was a bit wrong. There are better statistics than I realized, and thank you so much to Vocal for pulling these together so quickly. I won't go through them line by line, but the top line here is actually quite shocking to me, which is that of the 141,000 cases, felonies in New York State, only 19% of them ended up in a felony conviction. So the vast majority of cases that are even charged as a felony are not resulting in felony convictions. And only 10% are resulting in prison sentences. Of the close to 40,000 cases that are charged as violent felonies, only just slightly more than half end up with a conviction of any kind. Only 22% of them end up with a felony conviction, and only 16% end up with a prison sentence, and 9% end up with a jail sentence. So overwhelmingly, our cases that end up in our system are not resulting in serious felony convictions, yet we are punishing people before they're ever found guilty because of our bail system. So thank you so much to Vocal for pulling those statistics. I did not have them at my fingertips before, but that's a revelation to me as well.
Thank you, Scott. Taking a look at those statistics, it makes it far less justifiable for such a large percentage of pretrial detainees. So it's mind-boggling. In both categories, which are more likely to end with a dismissal than with a felony conviction. And so, why should we allow charge-based carve-outs if only 60% of violent felony cases are strong enough to generate a prison sentence, and so many cases are ultimately dismissed? That was, are you there, Scott? I lost your sound.
All right, there I am. Okay.
Okay,
I think that's a great question, and I think, as with so many things, policy decisions in criminal justice are rarely made because of good evidence. They're often made on the basis of fear, right? These carve-outs that people suggest are not backed up by statistics. They're not backed up by facts and evidence. What they are backed up by bad press headlines and fear among politicians. So I think the challenge for advocates and the bail reform movement is to hold policymakers accountable to the facts, right? Most people come back to court. Most people do not reoffend when they're out. And most cases do not result in a felony conviction, and the vast majority of cases do not result in any jail time at all. And if that is the case, we can't structure our bail system and our pretrial justice system around the one-off cases that inspire fear in politicians, but are really not reflective of what's going on day in and day out.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Scott. At the risk of overworking you, let me add this. This is the question from Suraj, and it goes, do we know what factors these risk assessment algorithms look at when assigning risk?
Sure. Again, this is a really long and this is a very, really complicated field and question and issue. But what I will say is that the risk assessment instruments are always based on past behavior, right? So the data that is used to create them is taken from, past arrests, past convictions, and data that is, drawn from the criminal justice system. And the factors that are used, then the individual factors that are used to predict someone's risk of either reoffending or failing to appear are generally always based on their prior contacts with the criminal justice system. And just by saying that, you can see what a lot of the inherent problems, right? So whether somebody has had a conviction in the last year or the last 2 years, whether they've had a drug conviction in the last year or 2 years, whether they've missed court, in some period of time. But what you can see is that the sort of structural racism that is built into the system, right? We know that people of color are disproportionately targeted for police contact and for arrests, that they are convicted at higher rates, so they have bail set at higher rates, which means that the sort of structural racism that is built into our criminal justice system already ends up getting hardwired into these risk assessment instruments. And then the individual factors that go into determining an individual's score are also going to reflect that same underlying discrimination, right? So the main problem with the factors that go into creating these risk assessment tools and the factors that are then used to determine an individual's risk is that they are inevitably tainted by our history of racist law enforcement in this country and the way that we have disproportionately targeted income or low income and communities of color for law enforcement.
And thank you, Scott. My next question is for Danielle. We got you back, Danielle. Good. Are you there? Hi, Danielle.
Sorry, my boyfriend has a dog, so I have one too. So I have to take care of him.
Life goes on, even during a webinar. Right? Okay, Danielle, in addition to bail reform and discovery and speedy trial, how do we hold prosecutors accountable? Is there anything that can happen on the local level?
I mean, I think that's such a great question. I think one thing that we need to do is probably do a real analysis of district attorneys' offices. I think we need to be looking at data in regards to, I would love to see race-based data. So looking at plea offers, looking at who is getting offers to probation and who's getting offers to incarceration. I think there should be really just a study done on district attorney offices, perhaps over the course of a year or 2 years, to determine whether there are, and I would say there are, even without having the data, implicit biases within the system of offering pleas. So from my own personal experience, I have clients, for the first part of my career as a public defender, I worked in the towns. So the majority of my clients were actually white people. And then I moved into the city, and the majority of my clients are people of color. And I can tell you that the differences in the offers that I got were remarkable. Most of my clients who where in the towns were most of the time they were offered a reduction to a violation. And when I moved into the city, you just would see that the pleas would involve incarceration. Even if it's a young kid with no record, it would involve probation. And I think that's because there's a belief that people of color are inherently criminal, and that they constantly have to have some type of, they have to be, have some overseer, whether that's the probation office or whether that's officers. So you see such a discrepancy in who is offered certain pleas. And I think we should really have some data on how the district attorney's office, or what pleas are they given to certain people. And then from that, you know, there's next steps. But I think at first we have to have that data.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you, Danielle. Can you hear me?
Yes, I
Okay.
can.
Great. I had a little technical difficulty at where my signal went out for a moment, so I had to switch mics. So I'm hoping that everyone can hear me. Katie, are there any further questions to be read at this point?
No, let's move on to the presentation.
Okay, great. All right. Anyway, to our listeners, our viewers, thank you. Those were great questions. Now I want to take a minute to review and discuss where we go from here. First, why does New York need bail reform? A few key things to remember. First, the number of people impact. On any given day, tens of thousands of New Yorkers are locked up simply because they cannot afford bail. They've not been convicted of a crime, but face extended periods of time in jail that can lead to a loss of jobs, housing, benefits, and even custody of children. New York's unjust bail system leads to racial disparities. Black New Yorkers are twice as likely to be incarcerated pre-trial. It also leads to for-profit extraction. The for-profit bail industry makes between 1.4 and 2.4 billion per year. The bail system leads to unjust case outcomes and wrongful plea deals. Because people who are incarcerated pre-trial are far more likely to take a plea deal, you can imagine how this works. When someone is locked up pre-trial, whether or not they are innocent, they're desperate for the ordeal to be over. It makes it far easier for prosecutors to coerce plea deals. All of this serves to criminalize low-income people. In a recent New York Civil Liberties Union report that looked at just 8 of New York's 62 counties between 2010 and 2014, they found that more than 35,000 New Yorkers spent at least one night in custody on a bail of $1,000 or less, and more than 21,000 on $500 or less. Even low bails can result in pretrial incarceration and horrific consequences for people's lives. To address this horrific consequence, any true bail reform must eliminate money bail. No one should be incarcerated simply because they cannot afford to pay. Protect the presumption of innocence. The fundamental protection of our justice system is innocent until proven guilty. People should not be locked up pre-trial, functionally guilty until proven innocent. Let's vastly reduce pre-trial incarceration. People charged with misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies must not be incarcerated pre-trial. And to protect due process, so when someone is charged with a serious felony, the court must hold an evidence-based hearing that demonstrates probable cause and a risk of intentional flight before any pretrial incarceration. We must also be very clear what is unacceptable in any bail legislation. Yes, we must clearly and loudly reject 1, mass community surveillance. We cannot allow for expansive use of electronic monitoring and the creation of open air jails or excessive pretrial supervised release conditions. And 2, risk assessment tools to assess dangerousness and determine if someone should be incarcerated pretrial. These algorithms rely on flawed and racially biased data and have no place in the pretrial system. Next, money bail and the for-profit industry. must be addressed. Carve out which maintain money bail for certain charges, including domestic violence and misdemeanors. We now have transformative bail legislation introduced in both the Assembly and the state that meets these needs and demands. This bill, sponsored by Governor Gianaris and Assembly Member O'Donnell, is the boldest bail legislation in the country and would, 1, eliminate money bail, 2, reduce racial disparities in the criminal justice system, 3, decarcerate jails and massively reduce the number of New Yorkers incarcerated pre-trial, 4, protect the presumption of innocence and the right to freedom, and finally, protect against community surveillance and criminalizations. Also, there will be a guarantee to individualized justice and due process, and to require pre-trial data to be collected and made public. However, another bail